Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon and Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Michael Bedenbaugh, a political analyst and author whose latest book, Reviving Our Republic, 95 Theses for the Future of America, argues the need for political renewal in the United States and presents recommendations for such reforms in a historical context. Mike's diverse background includes 5 years of service in the U.S. Navy, as well as previously serving as President and Executive Director of Preservation South Carolina, working to protect and preserve the state's historic places. In this episode, Alon and Mike discuss the ceding of congressional power to the president over the years and how that power shift looks under Trump, the crisis of leadership in the United States, and the possibility of going, as Mike describes, back to the country's foundational goal of neutrality.
So again, first, Mike, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. And I apologize for postponing it twice. The second reason is I can justify. I read it already with a great deal of interest. Your book is absolutely revealing, and it is overdue when it comes to calling about the revival of United States foreign and domestic policies. Is certainly overdue. And you have covered just about every important topic that's been affecting our life here in the United States. And you did so with extraordinary balance.
Thank you.
Take on what actually has been happening. And that is really remarkable because most authors I read about or write their book, there's always high level of biases. And you have seem to have risen above that in a very significant way.
Well, I tried to be very intentional with that, and that's the only way we're going to get out of this mess.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets me into a little trouble because each side finds fault. But I tell you, when I ran for Congress, I had as many left liberals as right conservatives in the room agreeing with 80% of it. Which is what, because it's about systems and not about policy per se. There's a little policy, but mostly it's about how to set the foundational systems back to be secure. Yeah. And that's what I tried to do.
And of course, there is a direct impact, the system itself, how that affects policy. That is, what you are, articulating, the system itself is affecting our policy. And at this point, is adversely in just about from every angle I see it, the way you articulated in the book. So my first question to you, for the sake of our audience to know, from your perspective, what this book is all about, as briefly, and what are you trying to achieve?
Well, the book is about optimism, is about that we can work our way through this with an element of knowledge and a sense of purpose and intention. This nation was founded as intentionally as any nation ever had on the face of the earth. And it was the product of time, a coincidence of timing, geography, and world events that very rarely happens on the planet in the human experience. Right. And, a lot of our evangelical friends here think, well, this means it was the hand of God on it. People could attribute whatever they want, but it just happened to be circumstances that created something that was so unique. And I tried to show how valuable that gift was. Whether it came from the universe or circumstances or coincidence, it was a gift handed to us. And what I've tried to communicate is there's a lot of folks that were, as many people who know heirs to big fortunes, they don't really appreciate what they inherited. And we have a lot of Americans in this country that doesn't really understand the fragility of the gift they have in their hands. And that's what we see happening right now. And so I just tried to communicate that and say there is a way to take care of this. And here's my thoughts. What do you think? And that's it.
No, I think what you have articulated in the book is truly is spot on. These are issues that need to be addressed. And there's certainly not a single party that can address that. There's a problem with the elected officials, starting with the president. There's a problem with the elected, Congress, both houses. There are problems with the local, state elections, and you alluded that specifically when the crowd of college, etc. So, but let me begin with something with the over the years, Congress slowly ceded more and more authority, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, to the president.
Mhm.
And successive presidents began to take advantage of that. And the one thing that you are all talking about, waging a war, attacking another country without getting any advice or consent from congressional approval.
Mhm.
That is, and then of course, if we bring it to this time, to this era, we can see how Trump is further taking and assuming far greater power than the Constitution allows. Can you elaborate further on this?
Well, what's fascinating to see what has happened in Donald Trump building a coalition of support. Um, we have always had an authoritarian element in our society, and that authoritarian element has always been scattered throughout society, but for some reason it has been able to coagulate around the current leadership.
Right.
And I know history enough in my nation to know when I saw that first debate in 2015. I lived in New York in the 80s and 90s. I knew Donald Trump very well from observation. And when I saw what was said on that stage in 2015 at that first debate, I realized that coagulation was going to start, because he was saying the system was corrupted, which the other side refused to say, and he said exactly what everybody knows, but his way of dealing with it was to control it his way. And then we got Project 2025 coming in. But I think the basic sense of it now, and this is the part that I'm most concerned about, is it's really not about Donald Trump anymore. He's just merely an avatar for a shadow that has now strengthened in the nation, that we have to figure out how to contain through, as much as we love to say, through reason, discussion, and opposition, but put as much daylight as we can to lessen the shadow, because that shadow is here.
But
And
then, I'm sorry, but then the question is this. If you take Trump out of the equation at
mhm.
this point, then well, he still have more than 3 years to go, and he could continue to cause extraordinary damage.
Oh,
My
absolutely.
concern is some of that may not be reversible anytime soon. So how do you prevent this trend of the president assuming more and more power, and how you prevent it to get to a point where look what he's doing? I mean, he's playing, has the playbook of a dictator, and he's following just
Yeah.
about every step to achieve his ultimate objective. And the question is, do we wait until his term expires? What are the actions that need to be taken today, and by whom, to begin to put a check on what he's doing, what he's planning to do? I mean, this is really because you raised all the right question in your book. Very important question about this particular point. The point that I am troubled, this was troubling me right now, is how do we do, what can we do in order to arrest, to slow his what he feels is to his right to assume any more power, and basically ignoring much of the constitutional limitation that imposed on president, on the Congress, etc.
Yeah. Well, that's two parts of that. Um, how do we arrest it and mitigate it? I honestly don't know if it's possible to do. I have accepted the fact that we are getting ready to go through a time of troubles, and I love using that because that's the old Russian history, with the rise of the Romanovs. The time of troubles in Russian history. We're getting ready to go through a really bad time of troubles, and only through that process will enough people, hopefully, will see the errors of our ways and start coalescing around solutions. So I am hoping that a lot of these other people will be able to see. I want to get it out there as much as possible so that something could coagulate around a solution as the troubles hit, because they are going to happen. And, our nation has gone through really traumatic times in the past. And we're a very spoiled society that we're not used to that. And so, one of the articles I did for the European talked about, the first one I did back in January, actually stated that Trump is the exact virus we need, and Trumpism, to show us where our illness is. And will the treatment be something that we can survive? Because of all the trajectories we can go through, several of the trajectories are that the United States doesn't survive it in the same way we were before we went into it. And I really recognize that. So all we can do and all I can do is give my life's history, the learning, the knowledge I've had, and contribute that as a mission to my citizenship, to say, here is what we need to do. Here is what I feel. Here's what I'm ready to carry the torch for. Who's with me? And hopefully we can start giving some purpose to the rebellion against it. Because the No Kings rallies were wonderful, but they were nothing but about against kings, but not for solutions, really, except one or two little things, and everybody had different solutions. That we have to correlate, we have to put form to solutions. And I don't mean to be hubris, but I always aim high. So here's my book, and I'm hoping that does the trick to at least get conversations going.
But then, let's talk about, in a practical sense, what is going to take to promote what you are saying, or to correct the problems that you are raising rightfully in your book. That is, let's look at our political scene today in the United States. I think that we have a crisis of leadership.
Yeah.
Do you concur with that?
Yes. Not only a crisis of leadership, but a crisis of fellowship.
Fellowship. So but you need, I mean, in a time of crisis like this that we have currently, we are in a crisis. I think we are in a political crisis. And so what is normally, I don't say normally, but often happens that in time of crisis, leaders emerge to try to answer the call. Now, do we see, because to begin taking some corrective measures to some of the wonderful things you are raising, to the question you're raising, we're going to have to start, would you say, with some leadership that is going to take the mantra and say, well, these are a problem we have to. What we are seeing today, the Democrats, those who are speaking loud, like Newsom of California, Pritzker of Illinois, like what's his name, the senator from Connecticut, they are criticizing, rightfully criticizing Trump about what he's doing day in and day out. But they are not providing alternative. They are not saying, well, he's doing this terrible thing. Instead, we have to do this. So let's look at for example, government shutdown. The focus is we cannot stop subsidies to those who need desperately health care. All right, that's a point they're trying to make. But the question is, what do you do beyond that? That is, what is the agenda that needs to be provided by some kind of leaders coming from Democrat or even alternative to the president within the Republican Party, who say, now we are charging in a terrible direction, we take terrible course. We've got to stop and begin to take corrective measure. Where do you see that coming from? How that's going to be galvanized? Who's going to do that?
Yeah, I don't, the thing about the current shutdown, and I'm a little prejudiced by me being in South Carolina and seeing the ultimate failure of the Democratic Party knowing how to get in front of anything. And unfortunately, I think they made a huge miscalculation on not providing closure for the 60 vote. All the Democrats could have still voted no and not invoke the fake silent filibuster and let it go through because if they would have allowed it to go through, then the natural process of people responding to it would have happened. And unfortunately, everybody, especially on the Democratic side, is too busy listening to consultants and policy wonks instead of just to their own internal sense of what should we do as individuals? What do we need to do? So I don't see the solution in the Democratic Party at all at this stage unless a personality rises above and changes the brand of the party in a similar way Clinton did in the 90s. Uh, but I just don't see that coming.
Well, what would you advise? I mean, if you were to ask you were running for Congress, you obviously have your own views, which I respect. If somebody come to you and they say, this is our problem. What should we do, Mike? Where should we begin? What is going to be the process?
Yeah, it takes an organization because it takes more than one, especially on the level where I am, right?
Mhm.
It takes more than one, and actually it wouldn't take that many. So let's look at my level of representative. Say there was some funding out there for 10 or 15 people to be able to be competitive in House races and get into the House of Representatives. 10 people who would form their own caucus, and let's just say the new Federalist Caucus or something that's centered around my 95 thesis, will control the House. They could
Yes.
control it. And to be able to say, fine, you want this bill passed because for whatever issues are going on, there is a reason the Republicans are in power. And you have to honor some sense of that with the public who goes, we voted for them, this is what we want. So, but to have a caucus where you say, fine, you want this to happen, we need to do ABC. And I think that's one way to start. Um, I think it's wrong for any political party out there that's opposing what the Republicans are doing to think they could strategize their way out of this by looking at old playbooks. Those days are gone, and all they're doing is undermining their own brand. I think there is more opportunity here for a third party to come about as much as since the Whigs rose up in defiance of Andrew Jackson, because I think that's the more perfect scenario. The problem is all of the mechanisms the parties have done to build themselves up into an impregnable force, um, which is why it's going to take a lot more pain for people to realize that things need to change. And
Yeah,
that's just a
when you
hard
mentioned
truth
the
to it.
third party, I mean, historically speaking, third party never really made it. And so they didn't hardly make a really dent in the political discourse of the country. At the time, Ross Perot was one who actually showed some real significant followers, but even then, it did not go far enough. So
No,
I'm not sure the answer is the creation of having a third party. We are two-party system, and we are based pretty much, I think, we stuck with that. And so the question is, how do you take the Democrats who have been stuck with the mission, with a narrative that need to be dramatically changed, and the Democrats have taken it to extremism, as we are witnessing today.
yeah,
So there is this a huge gap, the huge division, polarization, the political polarization. I haven't seen it to such depth in the 50 years that I've been in this country.
yeah.
And that worries me. That is, how do you ameliorate that? How do you mitigate that horrific gap that is growing? It's becoming worse. I mean, the shutdown is only shutdown of the government. It's only a small one manifestation of that. Both are holding to their position. They don't want to compromise. The president Trump doesn't give a hoot about what's going on, and here we find ourselves in the state, which is a terrible state for America to be in the state.
Yeah, it is. I will push back a little bit on the concept that we are fixed in a two-party system. I know that it's been the traditional because we have, either first past the post or winner take all. And in that type of voting system, it tends to drive to two parties. And that's what tends to happen with that. And so part of my book goes into how to break the two-party system by, other type of voting systems like ranked choice voting, breaking the power of money that is involved. I think there's ways to do that. I see that as the only way America can right itself. We need to be able to create systems that give equal footing to multiple parties. And that's part of what I talk about, because right now what we have is the outcome of the monopolization of the energies of these two parties that are really only being run by 15 to 20% of the country on either side. And the opportunity for, even if it means going to another two-party system, which is what we've had happen before when our two parties failed, and they kind of coalesced after a couple of elections into two different parties. That could happen as well, and it would be regional by state, those sort of things. And so that's the only way I see. I mean,
Well, I mean,
I
you elaborated quite a bit on the need for election reforms in so many different, on just about every level, in terms of financing, in terms of how the state election ought to be run. For example, I think one of the very important points here mentions the electoral system, which is now, why should we not take it all? I mean, that's to me, that is the greatest terrible mishap in our political system. That is basically many of the president, for example, as you well know, have won the election not because of not by popular vote, but because of the electoral system that we have. And I think you pointed that very well. That ought to change. Why should not be proportionate? That is based on how many voted for each for the candidate, and divide the electoral between the two parties. That would be far more representative.
right.
And of course, you're also talking about how to streamlining the financing of the various election, individual, etc. But then again, we are now stuck with the incredibly increasing power of big corporations
Yeah.
who are pretty much now deciding, affecting policy in just about every which way we can imagine, domestic as well as foreign. And you also wrote about that quite eloquently. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that, the growing power of these big corporations? And I take it a little further. That is, even if we were to assume we make a major effort of reforms, we have this major power, the corporate power, that's going to be in the way
Yeah.
to try to preserve their influence, their position. So how do you see that? I'd like to our listeners to hear that from you. How do you see that?
Well, first, what it's going to take is to get representatives in place that understand that we need to put reinforced antitrust laws on the books. We have to put those back in. I understand the concept of deregulation, and the Republican Party loves hollering deregulation. However, I also hear them say, why don't we have Walter Cronkite anymore? And whenever I'm sitting in a room and telling people, well, we don't have Walter Cronkite because Walter Cronkite was created out of a rigid antitrust system for news, that where the news channels couldn't profit off of the news that they gave out. And you were limited on who could own stations in every market. And the Telecommunications Act of 96 gutted all of those things. And
Yes.
I mean, I remember when I was at that time, I was managing a band, and I was shocked within a year of the Telecommunications Act. I couldn't just go to a radio station with a cassette in my hand and get my band on the radio, because it's being decided in New York, where all, the radio stations is owned by a corporation, and the DJs didn't
Right.
have choice
Right.
anymore.
Yeah.
So that turned everything around within 2 years, and it destroyed the independent music industry in the long run.
Right.
So, you know, again, there is no easy answer to all of this, except the pain that comes and the grassroots efforts that will pick up to where new leaders will come out of this. But we have to also look at corporations as state actors now, in the same way, in the way that the founders and the architects of our Constitution would have never realized. There's two things they didn't realize the power of. One was corporate power, um, which is interesting because they fought against corporate power with the um, East India Tea Company and threw their tea in the ocean, which is what helped spark our revolution. But they just didn't really realize how much influence it would have on American politics. They thought we were insulated from that sort of thing,
Right,
and
right.
we're not. And the other thing was the power of parties that would rise up. And Washington, they were so unified around the revolution that when they made the Constitution, they didn't realize parties would be so divisive. It only took 8 years for when Washington wrote his farewell address that he realized what was happening and what was going to happen. And he warned us how terrible they were. I think if they would have known that before the Constitutional Convention, they would have put a more parliamentarian system in place where it wouldn't be winner take all and divide the country
Right,
into two
right.
parties. But that's so. All that said, I think we have to have where states and the federal government can look at corporations to where we need to break them up to where they can't own everything. We need to be able to get to a place where there's 100 different companies running our mass media instead of five. And we need
Yeah,
to get
yeah.
back to that. I
I
need
am,
to be able to have an owner of the radio station here in Newberry, South Carolina, not be the same company that owns every piece of media in South Carolina,
that's
as
right.
well as
That's
20
right.
other states. And we
Yeah,
just have to break it up.
right, right. Well, I mean, that's obviously it's a tall order. But
Yes.
this is an issue. I mean, America is, and we're going to have to, it has to be addressed, and hopefully, gradually, there'll be some movement in that direction. I want to just talk about it for a minute, then I want to switch to foreign policy for a minute. The term limit. I've always been saying the term limit is so crucial. So we have constitutionally, the president cannot run for more than 2 terms, but it is not applicable to the House and the Senate.
Right.
And that is basically you have members of the House and the Senate who be elected again, time and again and again. The old saying is all well known that power corrupts, and they hardly do. They establish their own constituency, and they can count on being re-elected time and again. And then the corruption seeps in, and we're not seeing an insight to this. And you are absolutely on spot saying that need to be changed. The other problem I see, for example, electing members of Congress, they have to run every 2 years. They finish the first year, they start trying to raise money for
Yep.
the next
Getting on the
campaign.
phone and calling more
For
funders.
the next campaign. So how much are they really wedded to what's important, how to run the country? Look what's happening today in the House. I mean, it's the most disgraceful thing I have ever seen in decades. And again, I want you to sort of share with our audience, because I fully agree, term limits is a critical. Correcting the electoral college is very important. Let's talk from your perspective. How do you see that potentially change, and in how it might change? Who might instigate some change?
Well, what's interesting is, I've talked to a lot of different people about the concept of term limits. And just to give a foundation, I just want to remind all your listeners and anybody listening in on this, when the Constitution was written, each representative only represented 30 to 35,000 people. That's the
Yes,
size of my county now,
yes,
the
yes,
little rural county I live in. And they would have no clue that a representative would be able to gain so much power. But since we became a world hegemonic empire of power and money and influence, and now each representative represents 750,000 people and growing because the number of seats are fixed.
right.
Uh, that's just more power to accumulate on it that nobody ever expected.
If I,
And
if I may, I suggest you are in your book, you're suggesting the number of congressmen ought to be increased to
yes,
correspond so that each representative represent fewer than 750, perhaps
right.
back to 200 or 300, if not 70 or 80. because that's not going to be basically impossible. You're going to end up with 3,000 House members, and then you have ever hard to get any consensus just about on anything. So how do you see that? What was there is a number that it is? You might say
You
that
know,
it's
I,
more
I,
practical.
yeah, I don't know. I just know it's got to be less. I do have confidence that there is technology that can be used to help communication systems happen for a larger house to be able to communicate with each other. And so I'm confident something like that can come up. And but we do have to figure that out. You know, could our Congress run with 3,000 people in the room? And does that mean that the committees would be even more powerful because they're the ones doing everything? Uh, Alon, I honestly don't know. I just know they've got to be smaller, and we need to figure out how to make that work. I really think technology can help with that, and maybe even AI can help with that in the way how people vote and how they can communicate their thoughts. But here's the thing: it's one of those things that, and I dealt with this when I dealt with preservation. You have to be willing just to open the door to the conversation, to then more solutions will come. If we assume, okay, 3,000 is too big, we don't even try it, I don't think we've given enough credit to the fact of solutions could be found once you get in the room and try to figure that out. But it's a messy business, and it's also why so many people thought that a nation can't be can be too big for a democratic system because it's so many people in so many different groups. I will say also part of the congressional rehabilitation, I say, is also to repeal the 17th Amendment, and that is to put the Senate back representing states and not voting constituencies. Because the purpose of us having a bicameral House was to have two different constituencies conflicting a little bit. And one representing maybe trendy or short term needs on one side, which is a House, and then the Senate kind of soothing it over with more long term institutional solutions. That's something that will take a long time to get people to adapt
No,
to.
no, I think you mentioned that. Like, obviously, your suggestion, for example, as far as Senate is concerned, is to be more nominated or by the governor for that matter.
Yeah,
That is, a senator ought to be representing the state and not having any political allegiance to a specific party for that matter.
that's right.
And
That's right.
that is obviously would be an interesting change if we were to implement it. I have so many issues that you have wonderfully raised in your book on domestic matters. We can focus just on that, or we can just shift a little bit given our time limitations.
Can I just close on one thing on domestic? One notion
Please.
that I would love to pursue a conversation with someone is, since yes, the Constitution allows for no term limits on House members or Senate members. However, the Constitution allows the rules of the House, and the House can make its own rules. I suspect there is a way that the House could set up rules to where it will not seat members after they win more than 4 elections, and that be constitutional without
Yeah.
going through a constitutional convention. So that's the type of thing that could be remedied with a fulcrum caucus of 10 or 15 people who say, fine, you want this? Put this in the House rules and make it such a supermajority that it could never be broken. So
I knew that
that's a
there's
little
something.
creative ways that we could possibly do that.
But you also mentioned something very interesting, and I think is very valid. A person who held a congressman held a certain position and is retiring should not be taking a paid position in a corporation or company where he or she can now use their influence in Congress to benefit the organization of the company they're now working for. I think this is at least there should be some kind of time limitations that you
Yes.
cannot join at least for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And this is also very, very valid, and it should be implemented. Again, let me just go to a couple of issues from policy. You
Okay.
in your the general approach you are saying That is, the United States policy should be a little bit more. Neutrality should be administered more than we are administered. And when we speak about fairness in foreign policy or neutrality in foreign policy, I'm always faced with the problem. Well, we have always strategic and economic interests all over the world. And the question is, how do we balance? It is okay to be fair, for example, between, say, two countries. I want to talk to, because you wrote also a couple of articles about Iran, about the Palestinian of Gaza, which I also read. I don't want to touch on that a little in a few minutes. But going to that, that when we speak about neutrality, that has to be juxtaposed to geostrategic interests, economic interests, and the two will collide. No matter how you see it. How do you reconcile that? To what extent can you, in fact, maintain neutrality in foreign policy when you are basically guided by geostrategic interests, economic interests? Just by way, for example, we tolerate Saudi Arabia, which is, for all intents and purposes, a dictatorship. It's a kingdom, and the king has the last word. Why? Because we have interests, strategic interests, obviously economic interests, and others. So we compromise our principles because it serves our strategic or geostrategic interest. How do you reconcile that, given that you have taken the position we need to apply more neutral foreign policy?
I think we're on the road to now having our population realize the importance, realize the terrible error we've done in being so one-sided in our allegiances to certain allies, whether it be Israel, whether it be anybody. I think more and more people in the country are going, wait a minute, this is too much. And again, trauma can lead to revisiting our systems. And it will always be a tension, especially with America that has such an entrepreneurial, corporatized business class that you want to have trade all over. You want to have your companies be able to invest in places all over the world to bring resources in. And whenever you have a company with employees in a country, you're tended to want to then be military involved to protect them. I mean, this is a huge slippery slope, and it's a constant tension.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important, at least we go back to a foundational goal of neutrality. It will never be a perfect one, but we need to figure out how to have a long-term goal to develop a culture in our nation that being neutral is more advantageous to our trade and our ability to negotiate with other nations than being all in on one side versus the other. This is definitely an idealistic goal, but I think it's one worth having the conversation for, that hopefully could lead to something more than the mess we're in now, which is horrific.
Let's take your point there. Let's take this example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
Why the United States has consistently, from day one practically, been supportive of Israel, irrespective of what's happening with the Palestinians, what's happening with the neighborhood. And you alluded to that. I mentioned it actually in your book, that both parties need the evangelicals.
Yeah.
In any election, the evangelicals are what comes to Israeli blind. The support of Israel should be unequivocal, should be consistent, no matter what Israel does. And I mean, just to think about the horror that hasn't been unfolding in front of us the last couple of years in Gaza, yeah. And still, we provide this kind of blind support for Israel. To me, it's unconscionable. As far as I'm concerned, Trump, Biden before that, have been complicit.
Absolutely.
To the murder that's been taken, the destruction. Nowadays, in broad daylight, when the whole world is watching, it is, to me, this is still unfathomable. That is actually happening, and it's still happening. Where are the people who are saying enough is enough? This cannot happen. The voices here from them, yes, they talk a little bit to the Democrats, this is intolerable, this cannot happen. What action has anyone, in fact, they say enough is enough, this got to be stopped. What Trump has done, and got a ceasefire has already been violated half a dozen times.
Yeah.
And he goes there and he said, 80 years, nobody has achieved peace. Now we have peace. I mean, this is the biggest joke
Yeah.
I've heard in 80, in
It
50
is.
years.
It's horrible. And the fact, I mean, I've laid out, and I sent you some articles where I laid out a parallel with our Trail of Tears, how Jackson
Mhm.
kicked out the Native Americans, and
Right.
how Trump is going to kick out the Palestinians. God knows where they're going to go.
Right.
But there's a reason the head negotiators for this were two men that are very well versed and set up to do development in Gaza. I mean, that's who the peacemakers were. Steve, I forget his last name, and Jared Kushner. That's why they were there. That's what's going to happen. But what's interesting here for me to see is to see folks that many people thought was right wing conservative are screaming about the corruptive influence of AIPAC and Israel onto the American policy making sphere. And people like Tucker Carlson and these folks. So I'm seeing more of that, and it's shocking me how much I've seen. It will be a process, and it will not be reflected in anything yet. And the evangelical movement here, especially that's pushing the Project 2025, truly believe that we must support Israel. In fact, Ted Cruz was on an interview with Tucker Carlson saying how, he learned in Sunday school that God blessed those who blessed Israel. So that's why he became senator, to ensure
Yeah.
America would
Oh,
always
yeah.
bless Israel. And it's going to take a while to wash that through. I just fear the blowback from tens of thousands of young boys who had to hold the dead bodies of their parents and sisters, and what type of nihilistic, angry 22-year-olds they're going to be in 10 years. And
Right.
and we're going to have to face a reckoning with this that is going to be devastating. And
I
I
mean,
fear
I
for us for
that's,
that.
I absolutely agree. I mean, and then we laying now the foundation for the next 10, 20, 30, 30 years of continuing of bloodshed and conflict.
Yep.
And this is exactly what America, with this administration, the Biden administration, previous administration, are basically contributing to that day in and day out,
Yes.
prolonging the conflict rather than trying to find an amicable, mutually acceptable solution. And that is a tragedy. I
It
think
is.
it's a tragedy that it is, and I don't see really any any kind of ending to this horrific thing. I mean, I devoted much of my adult life to trying conflict resolution. I tackled this subject for day in and day out for years and years. And
Well,
and
and I was in Israel in 1980. I actually walked within 2 feet of Moshe Dayan. They were with the Egyptian delegation at the King David Hotel, and I'm 19 years old, and here
yeah,
comes Moshe Dayan walking within 2 feet of me. But the thing that impressed me then, and I didn't know the politics of Israel then, I was just excited to see Jerusalem. That's all I knew. So at 19. But I do remember, and I wish I could find the map. Our tour guide gave us a map of Israel, and that map had no lines on it anywhere. There was
no,
no
absolutely.
line to the West Bank. There was no line, and at the time, it owned the whole Negev. It hadn't been given up yet,
Yeah,
and it was amazing the how the state of Israel understood how to communicate to American grassroots and put that power. And then, of course, the last thing we went to see was Masada, and went up to Masada, and it was amazing to go up there. But the thing that kept honed into it is we will die first before we give up who we are. And all of those different things, this Masada complex and everything, is 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 a devastating aspect of what we've bought into. What will
yeah.
be fascinating is to see how quickly we can turn from this, and how we can help mitigate the blowback that we are going to have, and hopefully not overreact to the blowback, which would be devastating.
Yeah,
So,
but it is coming, and 90% of all Palestinians were born under occupation. 90%. Imagine 80% of all Israelis were born, so they lived with occupation. It was normal phenomenon. They're so detached from what's going on there. So it's a by the way thing that is happening, and that is going to haunt both Israelis and Palestinians. This is a question, and I'm afraid even I say it now. I say it may future conflict between the two sides may look at this devastation of Gaza just another episode. That how bad it can get if the put two sides don't wake up to the bitter reality
Yeah.
that they coexist, they don't have a choice, and they now must choose whether they kill each other for another century or find a way to coexist peacefully. And the power to be that can influence that is mainly the United States.
Yep.
Is doing nothing but perpetuating, deepening the gap between the two sides in the name of protecting Israel, when in fact they are undermining Israel day in and day out by their completely one-sided policy.
So what's interesting to me, and this I would love your thoughts on, is when I saw Donald Trump go down and have the signing in Egypt, which the paper they signed was nothing but we want to get along. I mean, it was no real policy. It was just him with a photo op on a stage with all
Of course,
these
well,
Arab leaders.
that's a Trump.
That's it. But what I'm wondering about is there a possibility that the Egypt and Jordan and some of these other nations would agree to take the Palestinians into their arms and through some sort of funding mechanisms try to give these people a new life? Because that's the only
but
way I
why
see
should
out
they?
of. Well,
Why,
I don't. Yeah.
why should they? Why should the Palestinians abandon their land? Lawful land belongs to them only because Israel has a historic ambition to create a greater Israel. I don't know if you listen to King Abdullah's address to the United Nations, and every word he uttered then was absolutely to the point. Israel today speak about greater Israel. You leave it to Smotrich and Ben-Meir and Netanyahu, the greater Israel. And if you look at what's supposed to be being a greater Israel, it has part of Jordan, part of Lebanon, part of Syria, and all of Palestine, mandated Palestine. And that is what terrifying these countries, what terrifying them, which means when you talk about greater Israel, basically you're telling to the Palestinian, there is no way you are going to have a state of your own. They have to resign to total and complete hopelessness. Under what circumstances will they succumb to that, to submit to that? That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And if anything, this war in Gaza has done anything but galvanize, albeit it has not been given physical expression other than what Hamas is doing. But those young people, the majority, 60% of the Palestinians under the age of 25, almost 70%, they have now poisoned. They are now poisoned.
Yeah.
Awaiting now, they will live now for revenge and retribution. It's only a question of when.
That's right. I totally agree.
In America, we are contributing this. I mean, it's really something that enrages me regularly. I want to switch another point that I think on that is your projection of American power, which you also eloquently talked about that. That is, today, United States has military presence of sort, some very large, like say, if you talk about Qatar, the largest military base outside the ground troop, to 70 or 80 or 100 troops someplace else. So we have military presence in 80 countries. Can you imagine? You know that. And if you analyze just every single one of them, you take away, you can say the administration will, Biden and Trump will try to justify our presence in Iraq, our presence in Lebanon, our presence in Syria, our presence, and on and on and on and on. But you are saying that should not be the case. That is, we need not to project military power at a horrific expense. That's number one. And then also alienating many of these host countries whether they accept them because they benefit from American military presence, because it's a revenue producing for them, or because they have to, because they don't have a choice. How do you shrink that number? What is going to take? And how that will have what impact on American strategic interests all over the world?
It will, for it to be done correctly, it will take a generation, because when you have this many people reliant on jobs, because our military has turned into a jobs program, in the sense of, we're not supposed to have a standing army in the nation, yet we have every state wanting to have a base near them because it's economic development. And and you know this more than I do. I suspect there's a lot of countries who are happy to have a military base in their country just because of the economic vitality that is for the local community. All of a sudden, American dollars are pouring in, and people are going to coffee shops or whatever off the base. So it's a conundrum, but it's also, again, a goal to start discussing. And it's nothing that we can just with one administration fix. But it is something that is it's like turning the Titanic from the iceberg. It's just going to take a lot of time to get us out of that. And I see the trends among many people to start thinking, why are we there? And especially the MAGA base is thinking that. Now, I think they're more reactionary, and it could be dangerous the way they want to do it, but at least the conversation has started. But the problem is now we have an anomaly with this current man in the White House who has absolutely no consciousness of the propriety or impropriety of this. I mean, so that's off the table on thinking that he can solve any of it. All of this assumes he and that Project 2025 MAGA core is not running things. And only then can we have a civil conversation about this stuff. But it's a long-term goal, and that's all I can aspire to. Some of this stuff is generational.
I mean, other than having military bases like say we mentioned Qatar, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, 7th Fleet in forward equipment, for example, in Israel. Few people talk about that. Of course, our forces in NATO. So there's legitimate presence because of alliances, because of an agreement. But 60% of the 70% of the rest is related somewhat to conflict. We are there because we want to prevent the conflict from escalating, or we want to maintain the status quo of sorts. But there is little effort done to push for peace and reconciliation. That is, instead of merely keeping guards with a rifle ready to shoot if there is disturbances, instead of saying, there is a conflict issue, let's focus to see if we can solve the conflict so we can withdraw these forces whenever be necessary. I don't see that taking place in a systematic way where you can actually forge a solution to the problem that we are there presumably to guard, to prevent from either escalating or preventing from something worse conflict to erupt. So there is no cohesive foreign policy today in America that it is addressing what you rightfully said, raised in your book, and that is America's projection of military power has gone way, way too far, too long. And I think you said there are 200, almost a quarter of a million American troops are overseas.
Yeah.
I mean, it boggles the mind of how much that.
What is fascinating to me, and whenever you study wars, every war starts out with the leadership fighting the last war to the detriment of the new war. And we are still in a post-Cold War mindset of thinking our troops will stabilize things, pushed by a military-industrial complex that makes money off of that engagement. So it's going to, here's another element, because I was in the U.S. Navy for 5 years. And the interesting thing to me, as far as the new war among great powers, God forbid that happens, because it would be the most devastating thing ever. But you see things coalescing along China, Russia, us, all these different, the poles are starting to coagulate around these different entities. And the thing that's fascinating to me is how proud we are of our aircraft carriers. And
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was the big flagships of the day when I was in the Navy, and I could see they took the carrier off the coast of Gaza. But the thing that's going to be amazing is, one, the aircraft carriers are only good for standing near countries that can't deal with us on 90% of the countries. But if we were ever to have a war with China, the aircraft carriers will disappear in the first week. They're worthless on a world war because the mechanisms, the technology of the battle scene, aircraft carriers are worthless because of they're only meant by us to project power on smaller nations we can control. And so that's just one element that I
Yeah.
find fascinating,
Yeah.
is our own vulnerability to thinking they will really stop any major conflict.
It's also of our own doing. I mean, talking about China, relation with China, the tension between the two sides, put Taiwan in the equation, and we have commitment to Taiwan independence and all of that. Is it really? And I want to respect our commitments overseas to any country for that matter. But is it really our business to go as far as Taiwan and guarantee,
Yeah,
knowing full well, I mean, the British at least were a little smarter. Finally, they gave up on Hong Kong and said, well, uh, there is a legitimate claim by China to these
yeah,
places. I mean, you cannot say this is not yours. We are 10, 20,000, 20 miles, 12,000 miles from Taiwan, United States, something like this. Am I right?
I
And
think so. Yeah, I mean,
how far is Taiwan from China?
oh,
I mean,
and that's a fascinating thing, and I think the same thing. As tragic as it appears, what would happen if China took over Taiwan, there is a realpolitik aspect
yeah,
to
yeah.
understanding, the same way we were jealous of anybody touching Cuba, and we had the Monroe Doctrine of no European powers in the Western Hemisphere around America, which is why I lived in Russia for a summer. I studied Russia. I was in the Crimea living with people, and when I had heard that Russia had referendum, whether it was legitimate or not, had taken the Crimea, and America and Obama immediately started screaming about it, I thought, you know, I don't know if that's the right thing on how to respond to this, because Crimea is a very special in the history of Russia. And to sit here and assume the Crimea is off the table just gets us into a 1,000-year history of another nation that we know nothing about. And there's some real serious things we need to look at about what we can actually do and how we need to understand we can't make everyone happy.
And we cannot accept the fact that we cannot make everyone
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah.
We enjoy, we became complacent to our being stuck. We're being stuck. We are stuck with Taiwan. We're stuck with so many different places, knowing full well China will never give up.
No,
Never. They have no
never.
reason to. Have no reason to. So when I say, instead of maintaining this kind of military commitment or whatever kind of commitment, instead of just maintaining that and hoping for the best, then sit down and resolve that conflict once and for
Yeah.
all. And imagine how the relationship, I mean, China, for example, is not, the China does not go on conquest. This is against their principle. They will not go and conquer other countries. But what they feel is theirs, talking about Taiwan, Hong Kong, maybe Tibet as well, that is something they are demanding. But they don't find Chinese going and invading other countries like we have made habit of it, in go to Iraq, go to Afghanistan, go to attack Iran, attack installation. I mean, this is like cowboys running wild in
Exactly.
in the West. And that is our plight, unfortunately, in foreign policy today. Well, Mike, I can't thank you enough. I wish we had more time, but I would love to have another conversation with you
I would be honored. That'd be
on,
wonderful.
on the subject. Thank you again, Mike, for taking the time. I'm really, really grateful. Gave me an opportunity to read another book in a short period of time.
Both of us have a lot of books to read.
Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.